The dust kicked up around Eleanor Crawford's boots as she stumbled for the third time that morning, her vision swimming in and out of focus like the heat waves that shimmered off the desert floor surrounding Camp Verde, Arizona, in the scorching summer of 1882. She pressed her hand against the rough wooden wall of the general store, feeling the splinters threaten to pierce her calloused palm, and forced herself to stand upright even though every bone in her body screamed for rest. "Miss Crawford, you look mighty pale," Mrs. Henderson said from the doorway, her plump face creasing with concern. "Why don't you come inside and sit for a spell?" Eleanor shook her head, straightening her shoulders despite the way her threadbare cotton dress hung loose on her thinning frame. "I am perfectly fine, Mrs. Henderson. Just the heat is all." It was not just the heat. Eleanor had not eaten a proper meal in 4 days, had been rationing water to make sure her father's old mare had enough to drink, and had spent the previous night mending fences on the small plot of land she was determined to keep running, despite everyone in Camp Verde telling her a woman of 22 had no business trying to manage a homestead alone. Her father had been dead for 3 months. Her mother had passed when Eleanor was just 16, and she had no siblings, no husband, no family to speak of except for an aunt in Philadelphia who kept writing letters begging her to abandon this foolish independence and come live as a proper lady should. Eleanor would rather die than admit defeat. She pushed off from the wall and made her way down the dusty main street, past the saloon where tinny piano music drifted through the doors even at 10 in the morning, past the blacksmith shop where the clang of hammer on anvil rang out in steady rhythm, past the small church with its whitewashed exterior already looking dingy again from the constant dust storms that plagued the Verde Valley. Her homestead was 2 miles outside of town, and she had walked in that morning because the mare was too old and tired to make the journey, and Eleanor needed to see if the general store would extend her credit just 1 more week until she could sell the 3 scrawny chickens she had left. They would not extend her credit. Mr. Patterson had been apologetic, but firm. Eleanor owed $17 already, and he simply could not afford to be generous when she had no clear means of paying him back. So Eleanor walked back toward home with nothing, her empty flour sack tucked under her arm, her stomach cramping with hunger, her head pounding from dehydration, and her pride burning fierce and hot in her chest like a blacksmith's forge. Xavier Irwin watched the stubborn woman weave slightly as she walked past the livery stable where he was shoeing a horse for old Tom Brackett. He had seen Eleanor Crawford around town for the past several months, had heard the stories about how she was trying to keep her father's failing homestead running through sheer force of will, and had noticed the way she held her chin high even as her circumstances grew more desperate. "That girl is going to kill herself with pride," Tom said, following Xavier's gaze. "Someone ought to help her." "She does not seem the type to accept help," Xavier replied, focusing back on the horse's hoof. He was 25, had been working as a horse trainer and general ranch hand since he was 15, and had developed a reputation around Camp Verde as a man who knew his way around horses better than anyone else in the territory. He had arrived in Arizona 3 years ago from Wyoming, looking for work and a fresh start after his father had gambled away the family ranch, and he had no intention of getting involved in the complicated business of proud women who refused to see reason. But something about the determined set of Eleanor Crawford's shoulders, even as she stumbled slightly in the dusty street, made him pause in his work and watch until she disappeared from view, heading toward the road that led out of town. "Her father was a good man," Tom continued, clearly wanting to gossip. "James Crawford came out here in 73, tried to raise cattle on that patch of land northeast of town. Never had much luck with it. The land is too dry, the water source too unreliable. He should have sold out years ago, but he was stubborn as a Missouri mule. Guess his daughter takes after him." Xavier grunted non-committally and went back to work, but he found his thoughts drifting back to Eleanor Crawford throughout the day. When he finished at the livery stable, he stopped by the general store to pick up the tobacco he favored, and found Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Patterson talking in low voices near the counter. "It is not right," Mrs. Henderson was saying. "That girl is starving herself. Anyone with eyes can see it. We should do something." "What would you have me do, woman?" Mr. Patterson replied, his voice weary. "I have extended her credit as far as I can. I have my own family to feed. If she would just accept help, if she would let the church organize a collection, if she would do anything besides insist she is managing fine when clearly she is not. They both fell silent when they noticed Xavier standing in the doorway. "Mr. Irwin," Mrs. Henderson said, her face flushing slightly. "We were just discussing, that is, we were concerned about—" "I heard," Xavier said. He paid for his tobacco and left, but the conversation gnawed at him as he walked back to the small room he rented above the saddle shop. He had no particular reason to care about Eleanor Crawford's fate. He barely knew the woman, but he also knew what it felt like to watch everything your family had worked for slip away, to feel the burning shame of poverty and failure, to want so desperately to prove you could manage on your own that you would rather suffer than accept charity. The next morning, Xavier rode out to the Crawford homestead on his own horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Rusty. He told himself he was just going to assess the situation to see if there was some way he could help without injuring the woman's clearly considerable pride. The homestead, when he reached it, was worse than he had imagined. The fence was falling down in multiple places, held together with mismatched wire and rope. The small barn was missing half its roof. The house itself was hardly more than a shack, its wood weathered gray by the sun and wind. A few scrawny chickens pecked listlessly in the dirt near the porch, and an ancient mare stood in a small corral, her ribs showing clearly through her dull coat. Xavier sat on Rusty for a long moment, taking it all in, and then he saw movement near the barn. Eleanor Crawford was trying to lift a heavy wooden beam, clearly attempting to repair part of the collapsed roof structure. She had the beam tilted up at an angle, was pushing with all her strength to get it into position, and Xavier could see from 50 feet away that she did not have the strength to complete the task. He dismounted and walked toward the barn, leading Rusty behind him. Eleanor did not notice his approach until he was nearly beside her. So focused was she on the impossible task she had set herself. When she finally saw him, she nearly dropped the beam in surprise. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp with alarm, and something that might have been embarrassment. "Passing by," Xavier said easily, though they both knew the Crawford homestead was not on the way to anywhere. "Looks like you could use a hand with that beam." "I am managing perfectly well," Eleanor said, her face flushed with exertion and her arms trembling with the effort of holding the heavy wood. "I do not need assistance from strangers." "I am Xavier Irwin. We are not strangers. I have seen you in town." He did not move closer, did not reach for the beam, just stood there, with Rusty's reins in his hand and an expression of polite interest on his face. "That is a 2-person job at minimum. Probably a 3-person job if you want to do it right." "Well, I only have 1 person, so I will make do," Eleanor said through gritted teeth. The beam tilted dangerously, and she struggled to steady it, and Xavier saw the exact moment when her strength gave out completely. He moved quickly, stepping in and catching the beam before it could fall on her, taking the weight easily and guiding it to the ground. Eleanor staggered backward, her face pale, and for a moment Xavier thought she might faint right there. "Are you all right?" he asked, genuinely concerned now. "I am fine," she snapped, but her voice was weak, and she had to lean against the barn wall to stay upright. "You had no right to interfere. I was handling it." "You were about to get crushed by a 100-pound beam," Xavier said bluntly. "That is not handling it." Eleanor's eyes flashed with anger and something deeper, something that looked like despair. "What do you want, Mr. Irwin? If you came here to tell me I should give up, that I should sell this land and move back east like a proper lady, you can save your breath. I have heard it all before." "I came to see if you needed help," Xavier said carefully, "and clearly you do." "I do not accept charity," Eleanor said, pushing away from the wall and standing as straight as she could manage. Though Xavier noticed she swayed slightly. "I will not be pitied." "It is not charity," Xavier said, thinking quickly. "I am looking for a place to stable Rusty and my other horse. The livery in town is getting crowded, and Tom Brackett mentioned you had barn space. I would pay you, of course. $2 a month per horse, and I would handle all their care myself. You would just be providing the space." It was a transparent lie, and they both knew it. The livery stable was not crowded, and Xavier had no other horse, but it was an offer that allowed Eleanor to accept help while maintaining the fiction that she was providing a service rather than receiving charity. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her hazel eyes searching his face for mockery or pity. Xavier kept his expression neutral, waiting, letting her make the choice. $5 a month per horse, she finally said, and you pay in advance. Xavier had to suppress a smile. Even in desperate circumstances, Eleanor Crawford was a shrewd negotiator. $3 per horse, paid at the end of each month when I can assess whether the accommodations are suitable. $4 per horse, paid at the start of each month, Eleanor countered. Done, Xavier said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out 8 silver dollars. It was more than he could easily afford, but he handed them over without hesitation. First month's payment for Rusty and my other gelding. I will bring the second horse by tomorrow. Eleanor took the money, her hand shaking slightly, and Xavier saw the relief that flashed across her face before she schooled her features back into careful neutrality. The barn is in poor condition, as you can see. I cannot guarantee. I will help you fix it, Xavier said. As part of the boarding agreement, I want to make sure my horses have proper shelter. That is not necessary, Eleanor began, but Xavier was already walking back to Rusty, pulling tools from his saddlebag. It is necessary if I'm paying good money for the space, he said firmly. Now let me get this beam into position and then we can assess what other repairs are needed. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Xavier could see her calculating, weighing her desperate need against her fierce pride. Finally, she just nodded and stepped back, letting him work. They spent the rest of the morning working on the barn in careful silence. Xavier did the heavy lifting, positioning beams and hammering supports into place, while Eleanor handed him tools and held things steady when needed. She moved slowly, her strength clearly depleted, but she worked with determination, refusing to rest even when Xavier suggested she should take a break. By noon, they had made significant progress on the roof structure. Xavier's stomach was growling, and he could not help but notice that Eleanor had not mentioned anything about lunch, had not gone to the house to prepare food, or even to fetch water. He remembered what Mrs. Henderson had said about Eleanor starving herself and decided to take a calculated risk. I brought some food in my saddlebag, he said casually, walking over to Rusty. Enough for 2 if you're interested. Seems foolish to let it go to waste in this heat. I have my own food, thank you, Eleanor said stiffly. I am sure you do, Xavier replied, pulling out the package of bread, cheese, and dried apples he had purchased that morning specifically for this purpose. But I made the mistake of packing too much, and I cannot eat it all myself. Would be ashamed to waste it. He sat down in the shade of the barn and began eating, making no move to offer Eleanor any of the food directly, just leaving the package open beside him where she could see it. He looked out at the desert landscape, the distant red rocks rising in the shimmering heat, and pretended not to notice Eleanor standing nearby, her eyes fixed on the food with barely concealed hunger. After several minutes of tense silence, Eleanor slowly walked over and sat down a few feet away from him, maintaining a careful distance. I suppose it would be wasteful to let food spoil in the heat, she said, her voice strained. Very wasteful, Xavier agreed, still not looking at her. He broke off a piece of bread and ate it slowly, then shifted slightly so that the package of food was closer to Eleanor. She reached out and took a small piece of cheese, eating it in tiny bites as though trying to make it last. Xavier waited until she had finished, then casually moved the entire package even closer to her. Help yourself, he said. I am full. It was another obvious lie. Xavier was still hungry, and the food he had brought was not nearly enough for one person, let alone 2. But Eleanor was so thin that he could see the bones of her wrists, and the way she ate that small piece of cheese told him she was even more desperate than he had realized. Eleanor took another piece of cheese, and then a slice of apple, and then some bread, eating slowly but steadily. Xavier pretended to doze in the heat, giving her the privacy to eat without feeling watched, without feeling pitied. When the food was gone, Eleanor stood up abruptly. Thank you for your help with the barn, Mr. Irwin. I can manage the rest myself. I am sure you can, Xavier said, standing and brushing dust from his trousers. But I will be back tomorrow with my other horse, and I should probably continue working on the repairs. Cannot have my animals under an unsafe roof. Mr. Irwin, Eleanor began, and then stopped, clearly struggling with herself. Why are you doing this? Xavier looked at her directly for the first time since they had sat down to eat. Her face was sunburned and dusty. Her dark hair was escaping from its braid. Her dress was patched and faded, but her eyes were clear and intelligent, and full of a desperate strength that made something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. Because you need help, he said simply. And because I have been where you are, too proud to ask for it, too stubborn to admit when I was in over my head. My father lost our ranch in Wyoming when I was 22. I tried to save it on my own, refused every offer of assistance, worked myself half to death before I finally had to admit I could not do it alone. By then it was too late. We lost everything. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I see you making the same mistakes I made, Miss Crawford, and I figure if I can help prevent that, I should. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. I am sorry about your ranch, she finally said, but this is different. This land is all I have left of my father. If I lose it, if I admit I cannot manage it alone, then what was the point of any of it? What was the point of him coming out here, of him working himself into an early grave trying to make something of this God-forsaken patch of desert? The point, Xavier said gently, is that he tried, that you are trying. But trying does not mean doing it alone. It means doing what needs to be done, even if that includes accepting help when it is offered. Easy for you to say, Eleanor said bitterly. You are a man. No one questions your right to own land, to manage a homestead, to make your own decisions. Every person in Camp Verde thinks I am foolish for not running back east with my tail between my legs. They think I should find a husband, let some man take over this land and tell me what to do with it. I cannot speak for everyone in Camp Verde, Xavier said, but I do not think you are foolish. I think you are brave and determined, and I think you have been dealt a difficult hand through no fault of your own. I am not offering to take over your land or tell you what to do with it. I am just offering to help you fix your barn and maybe a few other things around here that need fixing. You can pay me back when your circumstances improve. Or you can just consider it payment for boarding my horses, which is absolutely a real service you're providing. Eleanor studied him for another long moment, and Xavier saw the exact second when her resistance crumbled just slightly, when exhaustion and hunger and desperation overwhelmed her stubborn pride. Just the barn, she said quietly, and the corral fence, nothing else. Just the barn and the corral fence, Xavier agreed, knowing that once he got his foot in the door, he could gradually expand his help to include other necessary repairs. I will see you tomorrow, Miss Crawford. He mounted Rusty and rode away, feeling Eleanor's eyes on his back the entire time, and tried to ignore the strange flutter in his chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of barn repair and everything to do with the fierce, proud woman he was determined to help whether she wanted him to or not. Over the next 2 weeks, Xavier found reasons to visit the Crawford homestead every day. He brought his fictional second horse, a borrowed mare from Tom Brackett, who was happy to go along with the deception, and spent hours working on repairs. He fixed the barn roof completely, rebuilt large sections of the corral fence, and gradually worked his way to other projects, reinforcing the front porch, patching holes in the house's exterior walls, repairing the broken water pump that Eleanor had been hauling water by bucket to compensate for. Eleanor watched him work with suspicion at first, clearly waiting for him to demand something in return to reveal some ulterior motive. But Xavier just worked steadily and carefully, speaking when spoken to, but mostly keeping quiet, and slowly Eleanor began to relax around him. She still refused to accept food directly from him, so Xavier developed a routine of accidentally bringing too much and leaving the extras where she could access them. He would mention that he had bought too much jerky, or that the bread would go stale if someone did not eat it, or that he could not possibly finish the stew he had made the night before. Eleanor would protest weakly, and then the food would disappear, And Xavier would pretend not to notice how much healthier she was starting to look, how the sharp angles of her face were beginning to fill out, how her hands shook less when she worked. 3 weeks after Xavier's first visit to the homestead, Eleanor's old mare died peacefully in her sleep. Xavier found Eleanor sitting beside the mare's body in the corral, her face dry but devastated, and he sat down beside her without saying anything. "She was my father's horse," Eleanor said after a long silence. "He bought her when I was 10 years old. She was already old then, but he said she had good eyes and a kind temperament, and that was worth more than youth. He used to let me ride her around the property back when we still had enough water for the crops and enough money for feed, and it seemed like maybe this land could actually support us." "I am sorry," Xavier said quietly. "I kept thinking if I could just keep her alive, if I could just take care of one thing my father cared about, then maybe I was not completely failing," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "But I could not even do that. She deserved better food, better care, and I could not provide it." "You did the best you could with what you had," Xavier said. "That mare lived longer than she would have in most people's care. You gave her a peaceful end." "It was not enough," Eleanor whispered. "Nothing I do is enough." Xavier wanted to reach out and take her hand, wanted to pull her into his arms and tell her that she was more than enough, that she was extraordinary and brave and stronger than anyone he had ever met. But he knew Eleanor would not welcome such gestures, would pull away from comfort the same way she pulled away from charity. So instead he just sat beside her in the morning heat and let her grieve. Finally, Eleanor stood up and brushed the dust from her skirt. "I need to bury her." "I will help," Xavier said, standing as well. "You do not have to—" "I know I do not have to," Xavier interrupted gently, "but I am going to anyway." They spent the afternoon digging a grave in the hard desert soil, working side by side in companionable silence. When they finally lowered the old mare into the ground and filled in the hole, Eleanor stood over the grave for a long moment, her head bowed. "Thank you," she said softly, and Xavier knew she was not just thanking him for help with the burial. "You are welcome," he replied. That evening, for the first time, Eleanor invited Xavier into the house for coffee. The interior was sparse and clean, with minimal furniture and few personal touches, but Xavier noticed a shelf of books against one wall and a framed photograph of a severe-looking man who must have been Eleanor's father. "He looks like you," Xavier observed, nodding at the photograph. "Everyone says I have his stubbornness," Eleanor said with a faint smile, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "My mother was the gentle one, the compromising one. She tried to convince him to give up on this land, to move somewhere more hospitable. He refused, and she stayed with him anyway because that is what wives did. I think the land killed her as surely as it killed him. The hardship, the isolation, the constant worry about money and water and whether we would make it through another season." "Do you resent him for it?" Xavier asked carefully. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but mostly I just miss him. He was not perfect, but he loved us in his way. And he believed so deeply that a person should make their own way in the world, should never give up on their dreams just because things got difficult. How can I resent him for teaching me that, even if it has made my life harder?" "You can honor his memory without destroying yourself trying to keep an impossible dream alive," Xavier said. "There is no shame in recognizing when a situation is untenable." "Is that what you think this is?" Eleanor asked, her eyes sharp. "An impossible dream?" Xavier chose his words carefully. "I think this land is difficult and the odds are against you. But I do not think it is impossible if you have help, if you are willing to accept that you do not have to do everything alone." "I have been doing everything alone for 3 months," Eleanor said. "For 6 months before that, really? Since my father was too sick to work, I know how to be alone." "I am not saying you do not know how," Xavier replied. "I am saying maybe you do not have to be." Eleanor looked at him over the rim of her coffee mug, her expression unreadable. "Why do you care, Mr. Irwin? Truly?" It was a fair question, and Xavier found himself struggling to answer it honestly. When had this stopped being about assuaging his guilt over his own past failures and started being about Eleanor herself? When had he started looking forward to his daily visits, not because he was helping, but because he got to see her fierce determination, her dry humor, her unexpected moments of vulnerability? When had he started thinking about her last thing at night and first thing in the morning, wondering if she was eating enough, sleeping enough, taking care of herself? "Because I think you are remarkable," he said finally simply. "Because I have never met anyone with your strength and your conviction. Because I like you, Eleanor Crawford, and I want to see you succeed." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly at his use of her first name, and a flush crept up her neck. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Xavier said. "I know you would rather starve than accept what you perceive as charity. I know you work from sunrise to sunset every day trying to hold this place together. I know you loved your father enough to sacrifice your own future, trying to preserve his legacy. I know you are smart and capable and have a tongue sharp enough to skin a rattlesnake when someone crosses you." Despite herself, Eleanor laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that transformed her serious face into something radiant. "That is not much of a compliment, Mr. Irwin." "Call me Xavier," he said, "and it is absolutely a compliment. Sharp tongues are underrated." They talked until the sun set and the desert cooled, conversation flowing more easily than Xavier would have thought possible. Eleanor told him about growing up on the homestead, about the good years when the rains came and the crops grew, and it seemed like her father's dream might actually come true. She told him about teaching herself to read from her mother's books, about the letters from her aunt in Philadelphia describing a life of social calls and tea parties and endless rules about what a proper young lady could and could not do. Xavier told her about Wyoming, about the ranch his grandfather had built and his father had lost, about the shame of watching everything he had known disappear because of someone else's weakness. He told her about coming to Arizona with nothing but his horse and his skills, about building a new life from scratch, about the satisfaction of honest work even when that work was never quite enough to get ahead. When Xavier finally left, riding back to town under a sky full of stars, he realized with a start that he was in serious danger of falling in love with Eleanor Crawford. It was an impractical, inconvenient realization, given their circumstances, but it was undeniable nonetheless. He thought about her all the way back to Camp Verde, about the way her eyes lit up when she talked about books, about the quiet strength in her hands when she worked, about the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide beneath layers of pride and determination. He was definitely in trouble. The following week brought a crisis that forced Eleanor to confront the limits of her stubborn independence once and for all. A late summer storm rolled through the Verde Valley, bringing not the gentle rain they desperately needed, but violent winds that tore at structures and lightning that sparked fires in the dry brush. Xavier was at the homestead when the storm hit, helping Eleanor reinforce the chicken coop, and they both rushed to secure the animals and close shutters as the wind picked up. The storm lasted 3 hours, battering the small homestead with relentless fury. A lightning strike ignited a patch of dry grass near the barn, and Xavier and Eleanor worked frantically to put it out before it could spread, hauling bucket after bucket of precious water from the pump and dumping it on the flames. By the time they got the fire under control, both of them were soaked with muddy water and exhausted, and the storm was still raging. They took shelter in the house, and Eleanor made fresh coffee while they waited for the worst of it to pass. Xavier noticed she was shaking, though whether from cold or exhaustion or delayed fear he could not tell. "That was too close," she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "If that fire had reached the barn with the horses inside—" "But it did not," Xavier said firmly. "We stopped it in time." "We," Eleanor repeated. "If you had not been here, I would never have been able to put it out alone. The barn would have burned, the horses would have died, and probably the house would have caught fire too. I would have lost everything." "But I was here," Xavier said. "That is the point, Eleanor. You do not have to face everything alone anymore." Eleanor looked at him, and he saw the walls she had maintained so carefully beginning to crack. "I do not know how to be any other way," she admitted. "I do not know how to trust someone else to stay, to help, to not leave me worse off than I was before. Then let me show you, Xavier said. He set down his coffee and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that she could feel his presence. I am not going anywhere, Eleanor. I am not your father who gambled away everything, or your mother who could not survive the hardship, or your aunt who wants to change who you are. I am just a man who admires you more than anyone I've ever met, and who wants to help you succeed. Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears. What if I fail anyway? What if all this effort, all this stubbornness, is for nothing? Then we will figure out the next step together, Xavier said. But you are not failing. Look at what you have accomplished in 3 months alone. Look at what we have accomplished together in the past few weeks. The barn is repaired, the fences are solid, the pump works properly. You have resources you did not have before. You have options. I have you, Eleanor said softly, and then looked startled by her own words. You have me, Xavier confirmed, his heart hammering in his chest. If you want me. Eleanor reached out slowly, as though she was not quite sure she was allowed, and took his hand. Her fingers were calloused from work, her grip strong despite her exhaustion. I am not easy to be around, she warned. I am stubborn and proud, and I do not know how to ask for help even when I desperately need it. I noticed, Xavier said with a slight smile. I do not care. I come with a failing homestead and no money and a lot of very impractical ideas about independence, Eleanor continued. I come with no land at all and a family history of terrible decisions, Xavier countered. I think we are fairly matched. Eleanor laughed, a slightly watery sound. And then before Xavier quite knew what was happening, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief and tentative, over almost before it began, but it sent electricity through Xavier's entire body. I am sorry, Eleanor said, immediately, pulling back. That was forward of me. I should not have. Xavier cupped her face in his hands and kissed her properly, thoroughly, putting every ounce of feeling he had been suppressing for weeks into the gesture. Eleanor made a small sound of surprise and then melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and for several long moments they forgot about the storm still raging outside, forgot about the homestead, and the hardship and all the practical concerns that should have kept them apart. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against Eleanor's and smiled. I have been wanting to do that since the day I saw you trying to lift that beam alone and refusing to admit you needed help. That was only a few weeks ago, Eleanor said, but she was smiling too. Longest few weeks of my life, Xavier said. They spent the rest of the storm talking quietly and stealing kisses, and when the winds finally died down and the sun broke through the clouds, Xavier felt like something fundamental had shifted in his world. He had come to Arizona looking for honest work and a fresh start. He had not expected to find this, a fierce, brilliant woman who challenged him and frustrated him and made him want to be better than he was. Over the next several months, Xavier and Eleanor worked side by side to transform the struggling homestead into something viable. Xavier moved his few possessions from his room above the saddle shop and took up residence in the small barn, sleeping in the loft and insisting it was more convenient for taking care of the horses. Eleanor protested this arrangement, but Xavier could see the relief in her eyes at having him close by, at not facing the long, lonely nights alone anymore. They fell into an easy rhythm, rising before dawn to tackle chores, working through the heat of the day on repairs and improvements, spending evenings in the house talking and planning and slowly, carefully exploring the relationship growing between them. Xavier was patient, letting Eleanor set the pace, understanding that trust was something she needed to build gradually after so many months of forcing herself to rely on no one. Xavier used his connections in Camp Verde to help Eleanor find buyers for the eggs her chickens produced, negotiated a fair price for some saddle repair work Eleanor could do with her skilled hands, and even convinced Tom Brackett to hire Eleanor to help with bookkeeping at the livery stable 2 days a week. The money was not much, but it was steady, and more importantly, it gave Eleanor a sense of contributing, of earning rather than accepting charity. As Eleanor's circumstances stabilized, her health improved dramatically. The constant worry lines around her eyes eased. She put on weight until her dresses fit properly again, and her laugh became more frequent and less guarded. Xavier watched the transformation with satisfaction and a growing certainty that he never wanted to be anywhere else but by her side. In November, as the desert cooled and the first winter winds began to blow through the Verde Valley, Xavier asked Eleanor to marry him. They were sitting on the newly repaired porch at sunset, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink, when Xavier reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring that had belonged to his mother. "I know this is not the most romantic proposal," he said, turning to face Eleanor, "and I know we have only known each other for a few months. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life helping you chase impossible dreams and arguing with you about whether you need help with heavy lifting and kissing you whenever you say something particularly stubborn." Eleanor's eyes were wide, her hand pressed against her chest. "Xavier." "I love you, Eleanor Crawford," Xavier continued. "I love your strength and your pride and your fierce determination. I love the way you refuse to give up even when any reasonable person would. I love how you try to hide your soft heart behind sharp words and how you pretend you do not need anyone even though you're one of the most loving people I have ever met. Will you marry me?" Eleanor was quiet for so long that Xavier began to worry he had miscalculated, had pushed too hard too fast. But then she reached out and took the ring from his hand, turning it over in her fingers. "This is your mother's ring," she said. "It is the only valuable thing I have left from my family," Xavier confirmed. "I want you to have it." "Your mother would have hated me," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "I am everything a proper lady should not be." "My mother would have loved you," Xavier corrected. "She was strong and stubborn too, and she had no patience for people who put on airs. You would have gotten along perfectly." Eleanor slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Xavier Irwin, even though you are bossy and overprotective and have an annoying habit of being right about things." Xavier laughed and pulled her into his arms, kissing her until they were both breathless. "When do you want to do this?" he asked against her hair. "Soon," Eleanor said. "I do not want a big wedding or a fuss. Just something simple at the church with a few witnesses." "That sounds perfect," Xavier agreed. They were married 3 weeks later on a cold December morning in the small whitewashed church in Camp Verde. Mrs. Henderson and Tom Brackett stood as witnesses, and the preacher kept the ceremony brief and dignified. Eleanor wore her mother's best dress, carefully mended and let out to fit her healthier frame, and Xavier wore his only suit. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Eleanor like she was the most precious thing in the world, and several of the older women in attendance dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The newlyweds returned to the homestead that afternoon, and Xavier finally moved his belongings from the barn loft into the house proper. That night, by lamplight and with infinite gentleness, Xavier showed Eleanor all the ways he loved her, and Eleanor learned that letting someone in, letting someone help carry her burdens, did not make her weak, but rather infinitely stronger. The first year of their marriage was hard work, but deeply satisfying. Together, Xavier and Eleanor transformed the struggling homestead into a functioning enterprise. They could not raise cattle on the limited water supply, but they found success with chickens, selling eggs and birds in town, and to travelers passing through on their way to Prescott or Fort Verde. Eleanor's saddle repair business grew through word of mouth, and Xavier took on more horse training work, building a reputation that brought clients from neighboring towns. By their first anniversary, they had paid off Eleanor's debts at the general store and even managed to save a small amount of money. More importantly, Eleanor had learned to accept help graciously, to ask for assistance when she needed it, and to trust that Xavier would always be there to support her without diminishing her independence or taking over her life. In the spring of 1884, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told Xavier one morning at breakfast, simply and without fanfare, and Xavier's whoop of joy startled the chickens in the yard and made Eleanor laugh until tears ran down her face. "We are going to have a baby," Xavier kept repeating, pulling Eleanor into his arms and spinning her around the kitchen. "We are going to be parents." "Put me down, you fool," Eleanor said, but she was grinning. "You will make me sick." Xavier set her down carefully, as though she were made of glass. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need to sit down? Should you be working so hard?" "I am pregnant, not dying," Eleanor said firmly. "I am perfectly capable of continuing my normal activities." "But you should rest more," Xavier insisted. "You should not be lifting heavy things or working in the heat." "Xavier Irwin, you listen to me," Eleanor interrupted, poking him in the chest. "We had an agreement when we got married. You would help me but not smother me. You would treat me as a partner, not a delicate flower. That agreement still stands even though I am carrying your child." Xavier had the grace to look abashed. "You're right, I'm sorry, I just worry." "You can worry," Eleanor allowed, her expression softening. "But you cannot try to wrap me in cotton wool. I am still the same stubborn woman you married." "I know," Xavier said, pulling her close again and resting his hand on her still flat stomach. "And I love that stubborn woman more than anything in the world." Their son was born in December of 1884, on a cold, clear night when the stars seemed close enough to touch. Eleanor labored for 14 hours with Mrs. Henderson attending as midwife and Xavier pacing anxiously outside the bedroom until Mrs. Henderson finally took pity on him and let him come in to hold Eleanor's hand through the final pushes. When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and squalling, Xavier felt something in his chest crack open with a love so fierce it was almost painful. Eleanor, exhausted but radiant, held their son against her chest and looked up at Xavier with tears streaming down her face. "He is perfect," she whispered. "He is perfect," Xavier agreed, kissing her forehead. "You are perfect. I love you so much." They named the baby James, after Eleanor's father, with the middle name Thomas after Tom Brackett, who had been so instrumental in helping Xavier help Eleanor in those early days. Little James was a healthy, noisy baby who demanded constant attention and disrupted their carefully organized household routine in the best possible way. Xavier discovered that fatherhood suited him. He loved watching his son grow and change, loved the way James would grip his finger with surprising strength, loved the sound of Eleanor singing lullabies in the evening as she rocked the baby to sleep. Their little homestead felt full of life and possibility in a way it never had before. As James grew from baby to toddler, the homestead continued to prosper. Xavier and Eleanor expanded the chicken operation, built a new, larger barn, and even managed to purchase 2 milk cows that provided dairy products they could sell in town. Eleanor's saddle repair business became well known throughout the territory, and Xavier's reputation as a horse trainer brought steady income. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable, secure, and happier than either of them had imagined possible. On a warm evening in May of 1887, when James was 2.5 years old and Eleanor was pregnant with their second child, they sat together on the porch watching their son play in the dirt with a collection of wooden animals Xavier had carved for him. "Do you remember the day we met?" Eleanor asked, leaning against Xavier's shoulder. "I remember watching you try to lift that beam alone and thinking you were the most stubborn woman I had ever seen," Xavier said with a smile. "I was starving and desperate and so proud I could barely see straight," Eleanor said. "I wanted to hate you for interfering, for seeing me at my weakest." "But you did not hate me," Xavier said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "I did not. Even though I should have. Even though accepting your help felt like admitting defeat." "It was not defeat," Xavier said firmly. "It was survival. It was the smartest thing you could have done." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, watching James stack stones in a precarious tower. "My father used to say that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that a true pioneer made their own way no matter what. I believed that for so long I think it almost killed me." "I think it would have killed you if you had kept going alone," Xavier said honestly. "But you were brave enough to let me help. even though it hurt your pride. That took more courage than facing it alone ever could have. I am glad you were stubborn too, Eleanor said, turning to kiss him. I am glad you did not give up on me even when I was being difficult. You are always difficult, Xavier teased. That is part of your charm. Eleanor laughed and settled more comfortably against him, Xavier's arm around her shoulders, and they watched the sun set over their land, over the homestead they had saved together, over the life they had built from stubbornness and hard work and love that had surprised them both with its depth and strength. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose, was born in September of 1887. She had Eleanor's hazel eyes and Xavier's dark hair, and from the moment she entered the world, she had her father wrapped completely around her tiny finger. James was initially suspicious of the new baby who took up so much of his mother's attention, but Xavier patiently explained that being a big brother was an important job, and soon James was helping fetch diapers and singing off key lullabies and generally making himself indispensable in the care of his baby sister. The years rolled by with the steady rhythm of desert seasons, hot summers and cool winters, dry spells and blessed rains. Xavier and Eleanor's homestead became one of the most successful small operations in the Camp Verde area, and their family became well-loved fixtures in the community. Eleanor's sharp tongue and fierce independence were legendary, as was Xavier's patience and his ability to gentle even the most difficult horses. Together they were formidable, and everyone in Camp Verde knew that Xavier Irwin and Eleanor Irwin were partners in every sense of the word. In 1890, when James was 5 and Margaret was nearly 3, Eleanor stood in the yard one morning and looked around at everything they had built. The barn was large and well-maintained, painted red with white trim. The house had been expanded to include 2 bedrooms for the children and a proper kitchen with a cast-iron stove Eleanor had coveted for years. The fences were straight and strong, the animals were healthy and productive, and the small orchard of fruit trees Xavier had planted 3 years ago was finally beginning to bear. This was the land her father had died trying to make prosper. This was the dream he had sacrificed everything for. And Eleanor had nearly killed herself trying to preserve it alone. But she had not been alone. Not once Xavier had ridden into her life and refused to let her stubborn pride destroy her. Together they had made something beautiful from desperation and hardship. Xavier came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "How far we have come," Eleanor said. "How close I came to losing all of this because I was too proud to accept help." "But you did not lose it," Xavier said. "You saved it. We saved it." "We saved each other," Eleanor corrected, turning in his arms to face him. "I was drowning in pride and stubbornness, and you threw me a rope without making me feel like I was drowning. That was the greatest gift you could have given me." "You would have done the same for me," Xavier said. "I would," Eleanor agreed, "though I hope you never have to test that theory." Xavier kissed her, long and slow and full of the comfortable passion that came from years of partnership and deep love. When they broke apart, Margaret was tugging on Eleanor's skirt, demanding attention, and James was calling from the barn that one of the chickens had escaped, and the morning chores needed doing. "This is our life," Eleanor said, taking in the organized chaos of their homestead, their children, their shared purpose. "This is our life," Xavier agreed, "and I would not change a single thing about it." They worked through the day side by side as they had done every day since that first morning when Xavier had shown up uninvited, and Eleanor had been too desperate to turn him away. They fixed what needed fixing, fed what needed feeding, and at the end of the day they sat together on the porch and watched the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. The years continued to pass with their steady rhythm. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and numbers and showed more interest in Eleanor's bookkeeping than in Xavier's horse training. Margaret grew into a wild, adventurous child who climbed everything she could reach and had no fear of animals or heights or anything else that should have terrified a sensible little girl. Eleanor and Xavier watched their children grow with pride and amazement, marveling at how two such different personalities could come from the same parents. In 1893, Eleanor gave birth to their third child, another son they named William Xavier. This baby was calmer than his siblings had been, content to watch the world with solemn dark eyes and make thoughtful sounds rather than demanding constant entertainment. Xavier joked that William had inherited his mother's ability to assess situations carefully before acting, while Eleanor insisted he had his father's patient temperament. The homestead continued to prosper through careful management and hard work. Xavier and Eleanor had learned through trial and error what crops worked in the difficult desert soil, which animals thrived in the heat, how to conserve water during dry spells and manage the occasional floods when the rains came too heavy and too fast. They made mistakes and learned from them, supported each other through difficulties, and celebrated successes together. In 1895, when Eleanor was 35 and Xavier was 38, they sat down one evening after the children were asleep and looked at their finances. "We have saved enough," Xavier said, reviewing the careful columns of numbers Eleanor had maintained for years. "We could expand, buy more land, increase our operation significantly." Eleanor looked at the numbers, at the evidence of years of sacrifice and hard work and careful planning. Then she looked around their small, comfortable home, thought about their 3 healthy children sleeping peacefully in the next rooms, considered their life that was busy but manageable, prosperous but not overwhelming. "We could," she agreed. "Or we could keep things exactly as they are. We have enough. We are happy. Why risk that for more?" Xavier studied his wife. This woman who had once been so desperate to prove she could succeed that she had nearly worked herself to death, and saw the contentment in her eyes. "You have changed," he observed gently. "We both have," Eleanor said. "I used to think success meant doing everything alone, proving I did not need anyone. Now I know success is building something sustainable with someone you love. It is having enough rather than always striving for more." "Your father would be proud of you," Xavier said, "of what you have accomplished here." "Our children will never know the desperation I felt that summer you found me," Eleanor said. "They will never understand what it means to be so hungry you can barely stand, so exhausted you cannot think straight, so proud you would rather die than ask for help. And I am grateful for that. I am grateful they will grow up knowing that asking for help is not weakness, that working together is stronger than working alone, that pride without sense is just stubbornness in fancy clothing." Xavier reached across the table and took her hand, the same hand that had trembled with starvation that first day he had offered her food, the same hand that wore his mother's ring now worn smooth with years of wear. "I am proud of you," he said simply, "of who you have become, of the life we have built together." "I could not have done any of this without you," Eleanor said, "and I do not just mean the physical work of saving the homestead. I mean learning how to be part of a partnership, learning how to trust someone else with my vulnerabilities, learning that letting someone help me does not diminish my strength." "You taught me things too," Xavier said. "You taught me that some things are worth fighting for no matter the odds. You taught me that real courage is not charging ahead blindly, but making careful, strategic decisions while maintaining your core principles. You taught me that love is not about grand gestures, but about showing up every day and doing the work alongside someone." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands across the table, 2 people who had found each other at their lowest points and had built something extraordinary from desperation and determination and love that had snuck up on them when they were not paying attention. Over the following years, Xavier and Eleanor watched with satisfaction as their children grew into capable, kind young adults. James went to school in Prescott studying accounting and business and returned to Camp Verde to help manage several local ranches' finances. Margaret shocked everyone by becoming fascinated with veterinary medicine, reading every book she could find on animal care and apprenticing with the local horse doctor. William, the quiet observer, developed a talent for making things grow, turning a corner of the homestead into an experimental garden where he tested different plants and irrigation methods. By 1905, when Eleanor was 45 and Xavier was 48, they were grandparents twice over. James had married a school teacher from Prescott, and they had a daughter and a son who visited the homestead frequently. Margaret, at 18 and still unmarried, insisted she was too busy learning to properly set a broken horse leg to worry about romance, though Xavier had noticed the way she looked at the young man who worked at the livery stable. On a warm spring evening, Eleanor and Xavier took a walk around their property, as they often did before bed. The homestead had changed dramatically from that desperate day in 1882 when Eleanor had been struggling alone and Xavier had offered help she was too proud to accept. The land was green from recent rains, the animals were healthy and productive, the buildings were well maintained and expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family and operations. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked as they walked. "Tying yourself to a starving, stubborn woman with a failing homestead and more pride than sense?" Xavier laughed, the sound warm in the evening air. "Not for a single moment. You were the best investment I ever made." "I was not an investment," Eleanor protested. "I was a disaster waiting to happen." "You were a fighter who needed a partner," Xavier corrected, "and I was a wanderer who needed a purpose. We fit together perfectly." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face her husband, this man who had saved her life by respecting her pride, who had loved her through stubbornness and fear and gradual, grudging acceptance. His hair was gray now. His face was weathered by decades under the desert sun, but his eyes were still the same clear gray she remembered from that first day, still full of patience and kindness and quiet strength. "I love you, Xavier Irwin," she said. "I loved you when I was too proud to admit it. I loved you when I was learning how to be part of a partnership. And I love you now when loving you is as natural as breathing." "I love you too, Eleanor," Xavier said, pulling her close. "My fierce, stubborn, brilliant wife. You made me a better man than I ever thought I could be." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who had built a life from desperation and determination, who had learned that true strength was not refusing help, but accepting it graciously, who had discovered that pride without wisdom was just another form of foolishness. The homestead that Eleanor had nearly died trying to save alone had become a thriving operation managed by two people who understood that working together was not a sign of weakness, but the greatest strength of all. Their children had learned that lesson from birth, had grown up watching their parents support each other through challenges and celebrations, through hardships and triumphs. As they walked back to the house, they could see lights in the windows, could hear the sound of their grandchildren laughing as Margaret told them exaggerated stories about her work with injured animals. This was legacy, Eleanor thought. Not the land itself, though that mattered, but the lessons they had learned and passed on, the understanding that community and partnership were not threats to independence, but the foundation that made independence possible. In 1910, Camp Verde celebrated its 40th anniversary as an incorporated town, and the town council asked Xavier and Eleanor to speak at the celebration about the early days of settlement. Eleanor was reluctant at first, uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but Xavier convinced her that their story was worth sharing. They stood together on the platform in front of half the town, and Eleanor spoke about those desperate months when she had been alone, about the pride that had nearly killed her, about the cowboy who had found a way to help her without making her feel diminished or pitied. "I was raised to believe that accepting help was weakness," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "That real strength meant doing everything alone, but I was wrong. Real strength is knowing when you need help and being brave enough to accept it. Real strength is building something together rather than struggling alone. Real strength is trusting someone else with your vulnerabilities and knowing they will not use them against you." She looked at Xavier, standing beside her, and reached for his hand. "This man saved my life, not by doing everything for me, but by respecting my need to maintain my dignity even in desperate circumstances. He gave me food by pretending he had brought too much. He fixed my barn by claiming he was protecting his horses. He gave me money by insisting he was paying for a service I was providing. Every step of the way, he found a way to help without hurting my pride, and in doing so, He taught me that pride and wisdom are not enemies but partners. Xavier squeezed her hand and she continued. We built this homestead together, raised 3 children together, weathered hardships, and celebrated triumphs together. Our success is not because either of us was stronger or smarter or more capable than the other. It is because we learned how to work as partners, how to support each other's weaknesses, and celebrate each other's strengths. That is the real story of the West, I think. Not rugged individualism, but people helping each other survive impossible circumstances, building communities where everyone can thrive. The crowd applauded, and several people came up afterward to thank them for their words, to share their own stories of help received or given, to acknowledge that the myth of the lone pioneer succeeding through sheer will was just that, a myth. Real success came from community, from partnership, from knowing when to ask for help and how to offer it gracefully. As they walked home that evening, Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had taken the lessons learned through hardship and pain and turned them into something valuable, something they could share with others. Their story was not unique in its struggles, but perhaps it was unique in how those struggles had been resolved, in how Xavier had found a way to help without diminishing, to support without overwhelming. The years continued to roll by with their steady rhythm. Margaret finally married the young man from the livery stable, and they opened a veterinary practice together in Camp Verde. William took over management of the homestead when Eleanor and Xavier decided they were ready to step back from the daily operations, though they still lived in the house they had rebuilt together and still offered advice when asked. James and his wife moved back from Prescott, and James became a respected businessman in the area, always crediting his parents' partnership as the model for his own successful marriage. By 1920, Eleanor was 60 and Xavier was 63, and they were great-grandparents to 7 children who ran wild around the homestead during family gatherings. Eleanor's hair was completely gray now. Her hands were twisted with arthritis from decades of hard work, but her eyes were still sharp, and her tongue was still sharp enough to cut through nonsense. Xavier's back bothered him some mornings, and he moved slower than he once had, but he still helped William with the horses when his advice was needed, still carved wooden toys for the great-grandchildren, still sat with Eleanor on the porch every evening and talked about their day. One particularly beautiful evening in late spring, when the desert was green from good rains and the air was cool and sweet, Eleanor and Xavier sat together on their porch and watched their extended family scattered across the property. Children were playing, adults were talking and laughing, animals were moving peacefully in their pens, and the sun was painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. "We did all right," Eleanor said, surveying everything they had built. "We did better than all right," Xavier corrected. "We did remarkably well." "Do you remember that day you showed up here uninvited?" Eleanor asked, when I was trying to lift that beam alone. "I remember thinking you were going to kill yourself with stubbornness if someone did not intervene," Xavier said with a smile. "I would have," Eleanor admitted. "I was so close to the edge, so desperate and so determined not to show it. If you had offered help directly, if you had pitied me or tried to take over, I would have sent you away, and probably would have collapsed from pride within a week." "But I did not offer help directly," Xavier said. "I found ways to let you accept assistance while maintaining your dignity." "You saved my life," Eleanor said simply. "And then you gave me a reason to live it fully. You showed me what partnership could look like, what love could be when 2 people respected each other's strengths and supported each other's weaknesses." "You showed me those things too," Xavier said. "You taught me that real courage is not refusing help, but accepting it graciously. You taught me that pride is not the same as stubbornness, and that knowing your limits is not the same as giving up." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching their legacy play out before them. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them learning by example what real partnership looked like, what it meant to build something together rather than alone. As the sun finally set and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Eleanor leaned her head on Xavier's shoulder and thought about that desperate woman she had been 38 years ago, starving and exhausted and too proud to admit she needed help. She thought about the cowboy who had refused to take no for an answer, but had respected her need to maintain her dignity. She thought about the life they had built together, the lessons they had learned, the love that had grown from desperation into something deep and unshakable. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being stubborn enough to help me even when I refused, for loving me even when I was difficult, for building this life with me." "Thank you," Xavier replied, "for being brave enough to let me in, for trusting me with your vulnerabilities, for teaching me what it means to be a true partner." They sat together until the stars filled the sky completely. Two people who had found each other at their lowest points and had built something extraordinary from stubbornness and hard work and a love that had transformed them both. Their homestead stood around them solid and prosperous, a testament to what could be accomplished when pride and wisdom learned to work together, when two people decided that partnership was stronger than independence, when help was offered and accepted with grace and respect. The Crawford homestead, saved from collapse by a woman's fierce determination and a man's patient assistance, would continue for generations. But its greatest legacy was not the land itself, but the lesson it taught: that true strength is not refusing help, but accepting it graciously; that pride is valuable, but not at the cost of survival; and that the greatest achievements come not from working alone, but from building partnerships based on mutual respect and deep, abiding love. As Xavier and Eleanor finally rose from the porch and walked into their house, surrounded by the sounds of their family settling in for the night, they knew their story had ended exactly as it should. Not with dramatic gestures or grand pronouncements, but with quiet satisfaction and the deep contentment of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, who had built together what neither could have achieved alone, and who had transformed desperate circumstances into a life full of love, purpose, and meaning that would echo through generations long after they were gone.